Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, our sources. Well, they're pointing to a real flashpoint moment.
Hmm.
It seems like international humanitarian ideas are really clashing with India's own domestic concerns. Things like sovereignty, security.
Exactly. And it really centers on this document known as the refugee card.
Yeah, the refugee card. There's this perception, and you hear it more and more from the government in our sources, that India's somehow been treated almost like an asylum or orphanage.
Right. This idea that anyone can just settle there, no questions asked.
And now the response seems pretty definitive, doesn't it? It's coming from two really powerful places,
Yeah.
the Ministry of External Affairs and the Supreme Court.
It's a classic deep dive situation, actually.
Yeah.
We're looking right into the limits of, global humanitarianism.
Mm-hmm.
We're really unpacking the tension here. It stems from a recent directive from a big UN agency, the UNHCR.
That's the High Commissioner for Refugees.
That's the one. The global body for protecting displaced people. They urged India to issue these formal refugee cards, Sharanarti cards they call them, to migrants already in the country.
And that card is the trigger, the immediate catalyst for this conflict. It's basically an ID, right? Issued by UNHCR for people fleeing danger, showing they're seeking protection.
Essentially, yes, an ID.
So our mission today is to figure out why this seemingly small request, an administrative thing almost, has sparked such a huge coordinated pushback from New Delhi.
Yeah, and we need to look at the arguments laid out in our sources, the legal ones, the diplomatic ones, and the resource arguments too.
Okay, let's start there. The first pillar seems to be diplomatic, led by Minister S. Jaishankar. His response sounds, well, candid. More realism than maybe unrestricted charity.
That's a good way to put it. Less about hostility, more about pragmatic realism. He's sort of demanding that, unconstrained giving has to consider national resource management first.
Let's unpack that realism then, because it seems tied to a pretty immediate, unavoidable challenge. Just the sheer number of people India is already responsible for.
Absolutely. I mean, the primary duty of any government fundamentally is caring for its own citizens. Jaishankar acknowledges India's history, a deep history of humanitarian help,
Sure.
but then he puts it in context. India currently has a population over 146 crore people.
Right, and just for context for everyone listening, 146 crore, that's 1.46 billion people. It's a staggering number.
It really is. And every single policy decision affects that huge population. The argument is pretty straightforward. Resources for things like infrastructure, health, education, they're already stretched thin.
Mm-hmm.
So adding potentially tens, maybe hundreds of thousands more people into a system that's already, struggling to meet the needs of its own 1.46 billion citizens. It's not just about being humanitarian. It's potentially fiscally impossible without serious trade-offs for the people already living there.
So, okay, how does the government square that? How do they defend that position against criticism that maybe they're turning their back on that generous history you mentioned?
Well, they argue the burden is cumulative. It's built up over time, and it's already immense. The sources really emphasize that India has already given asylum or refuge to multiple different communities over decades.
Okay.
Think about the long-term support for Tibetan refugees, Sri Lankan Tamil refugees, Afghan refugees, and more recently, Rohingya refugees.
Right, those are significant populations.
Exactly. They argue this history shows good faith, but the country simply isn't in a position now to offer blanket, unchecked asylum to every single person the UN might recommend.
And this is where Minister Jaishankar seems to really push back on the international stage, right? He made some sharp points about what he called hypocrisy from the West and other big powers. What did the sources say specifically?
He did. He noted that if the UN and its agencies are genuinely concerned about distributing the global refugee burden fairly, then they should also be aiming their requests and maybe their moral pressure towards countries like the US, the UK, France, China, Russia. The big players.
Oh, okay.
He pointed out this kind of double standard. You see Western nations routinely putting in place extremely strict, very restrictive rules, issuing ultimatums about who gets in, and often just shutting down their own asylum systems altogether.
I see. So the argument is, you guys have tight borders, but you're telling a developing nation with, frankly, fewer resources per capita to keep its doors wide open.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Jaishankar basically got the advice coming from those countries not logical, not reasonable, especially since many of them have way higher per capita wealth and fewer domestic resource pressures than India.
Right.
So the core diplomatic message is, look, India isn't going to be the world's default resettlement center while wealthier nations are tightening their own rules.
Okay, that clearly sets the diplomatic stage. But the government's position feels strongest because it has legal backing, right? Let's shift to that second pillar, the Supreme Court ruling, specifically from Justice Surya Kant. This seems to go to the heart of why India believes it doesn't even have to follow this UN directive.
Yes, and this is probably the single most crucial point, legally speaking. It's a detail of international law, but it gives India huge leverage. India has not signed the 1951 Refugee Convention.
Or the 1967 protocol.
Or the
okay?
1967 protocol, neither one.
Okay, for someone listening who isn't, deep into international law, why is not signing a document from decades ago so powerful today? Why does it let India reject a UN directive like this?
Because that 1951 convention, that's the main international treaty governing refugee rights. When a country signed it, they legally commit to certain principles, most importantly, non-refoulement. That's the idea. You can't force refugees back somewhere they face serious danger. Since India is not a signatory, the obligations, the rules, the directives that bind the countries who did sign, well, they just don't automatically apply to India.
So India retains control.
Absolute control over its own immigration and asylum policy. It can prioritize its own domestic laws and national security considerations above the framework laid out in that convention.
So the Supreme Court ruling, when it looked at this UNHCR card, essentially said, nice ID, thanks. But legally, this doesn't mean anything for residency here.
That's pretty much the core of Justice Kant's ruling, yeah. He clarified the UN card is purely an identification document. It has no automatic legal standing in India. Think of it like this. The UNHCR card is maybe like a library card. It proves who you are,
Okay.
but it's not a lease agreement. It doesn't grant you the right to live permanently in the country.
That's a really helpful analogy. It confirms identity, but not the legal right to settle or get asylum. So what's the practical outcome of that legal distinction?
The outcome is sovereignty. The court stressed that before anyone can settle or be granted asylum, national sovereignty demands full background checks, investigations, proper vetting, all overseen by Indian authorities. And if, after that investigation, someone is found to be a foreign national, violating Indian laws or, and this is crucial, posing a security threat, they can still be expelled.
So the ruling completely rejects any idea that some non-binding international document can override national security laws.
Exactly. It puts national law and security first.
Which connects the legal side right back to that major concern you mentioned earlier, the one raised by both Minister Joshing and the court. National security.
Absolutely. And this need for really rigorous vetting, it isn't just theoretical. Our sources point back to specific security incidents that have clearly shaped this stricter policy.
Like what?
Well, most notably, there was the 2017 controversy around Rohingya refugees. The central government, in an affidavit to the Supreme Court back then, explicitly stated that some individuals within that Rohingya population were found to have contacts with terrorists,
Wow. Okay.
posing, in their words, a clear and active threat to national security.
So an incident like that obviously reinforces the government's stance that this kind of strict internal vetting is absolutely non-negotiable before considering any kind of mass asylum.
It seems to have cemented that position, yes. And look, the sources do acknowledge India's incredible history of helping people, giving refuge to people from Pakistan in 47, Tibet in 59, Bangladesh in 71.
Yeah.
Huge numbers.
A long history.
Very long history. But the government's current position, as reflected in the sources, is that the world is different now. Geopolitical circumstances have changed profoundly. The need to protect borders and manage those finite resources we talked about, it just demands a stricter, more legally defined approach.